Welcome back to Ribbon Candy Hooking. I'm Deanna. Today let's look at primitive rug hooking, right? It's a specific area of rug hooking that refers to a style and a look of rug hooking. It is traditionally done in a wider cut. Primitive hooking means that you are hooking with wool, probably wool strips that are at least 1/4 of an inch, meaning a number 8 or up. Right? And by up, I mean you can either be cutting your strips with scissors, as I'm about to do, or clipping them and ripping it, and that would be very wide. Primitive hooking is hooking with wider strips. So if you're hooking with wider strips, it follows that you need to be hooking into a backing that's a little bit looser. You don't want to hook into one of the traditionally tighter rug hooking backings like monk's cloth or rug warp. Because it's going to be too hard on your hands. Can you do it? Yes. Will it be ideal as an experience, and will the outcome be perfect? Probably not. Your loops will be very tight in the backing. When you're hooking in the primitive style, you want a looser backing like burlap from the craft store or linen. This is bleached linen. This is also linen. This is non-bleached linen, and I'm going to be working this piece. It's a ribbon candy hooking piece that's based on an antique pattern, and this is called carousel prim, right? So it's a primitive carousel horse. But linen is a loose backing, burlap is a loose backing. I'm going to be hooking very wide. So when I'm hooking in a primitive manner, I'm not just talking about, the word prim is a shapeshifter, right? Because I'm not just talking about the technique of hooking wider pieces. Sometimes people refer to prim also as a color palette, right? Very traditional color palette, colors that maybe look like they might be dyed with natural dyes, very old time, right? But really, you could hook in the primitive style with any colors you want. I just took out some colors from my scrap bag here that are different wools. Some of them are ones that I've dyed. Some are solid. Some are thicker, things that I've cut off of clothing. This is a spool that was meant for braiding. It's a little bit thinner, but still wool. So I'm going to decide how I want to hook this piece. I'm hooking it with wider strips that I'm about to cut, and I'm hooking it with a wider hook. Because if you look at the difference between these two little hooks, this one is quite small. This is like a fine hook, right? And this is going to pull through because of the tiny crook in it, right? The tiny head on it. This is going to pull through very thin yarn and very thin cut wool strips. Whereas this, I don't stock this, right? I stock this size, but I stock this brand, the Joan Moshimer brand. And this is the coarse or primitive hook, right, with the blue on it. That's how you know. This is the largest head on a hook. You can see that this head is way more capable than this one of grabbing a big, thick piece of material and dragging it through, right? That makes just logical sense. So I'm going with a hook that's bigger and more suited to hooking like this. If you're using crochet hooks, if you're a beginner, then go for a hook that's like a 4 or up, right? Because it has a bigger head and it has a bigger crook. The crook is the part that catches it inside, right? Like Little Bo Peep crook. I'm going to choose some colors to fill in carousel prim, and I'm going to prep my material like this. Say I want to use this material around the horse. I do want to use this material around the horse. I have 2 choices, right? Well, I have 3 choices. If you're a beginner, you might not have any kind of cutting machine yet. If you have a cutting machine, then you want to put on your number 8 or 9 blade to make primitive strips. If you don't have that yet, you can cut with scissors like this and just do it by eye. You don't want them too thin. You want them about 1/4 of an inch. Does it have to be like really specific and really carefully cut? No, not at all. You could also, if you're a quilter or you have a rotary cutter, right, use a ruler and a rotary cutter, cut them that way. I can cut strips like that with my scissors, or I can cut them just to clip them like that. And if we're talking about real wool, it's going to rip down. You're not going to be able to rip really small pieces because if you do, for example, if I do something very narrow, it doesn't want to rip, right? It's not thick enough. It's just going to atomize. As you can see, it's going to separate. So using scissors to cut your strips is really ideal with prim style. You just cut them by eye, and you get used to seeing how wide you have to cut them. This is just over 1/4 inch. It's definitely over 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to start working with them in this way. So either scissors, do you want to come around my side? Either scissors or just snipping with scissors and then doing the old ripsies. And I'm going to be hooking the same way that I would any other piece. I'm starting by pulling up my tail first, only because I don't want to lose track of that tail and I don't want to yank it out by accident. I have other videos on ribbon candy hooking that show you my hands underneath as I pull the material through, right? So that's a different video altogether. I'm hooking a little bit wider than I normally do. And I'm being thoughtful about where I'm putting the hook in to pull the next loop up. It's not a science. I can't tell you it's every other loop, every other hole in the mesh. I can't tell you it's every 1.5. You just have to gauge it by sight. And as you pull your loops up, you want to be sure, anticipating that they're getting packed in on every side as I finish the piece up and complete it. Having said that, if there are big gaposes in them, right, they're called holidays, when you can see gaps and you can see space in between the fabric, this probably, you're not going to be able to see anything, right, because when everything is filled in, it's going to be quite dense. So that's something you have to gauge and figure out, get a feel for through experience. You just work it for now. Try not to put your loops too close together, because that's called packing, right? And that can really distort the piece, and that can really warp your backing fabric. It'll start to want to buckle, as you can imagine, if it's too dense, right? So I'm pulling up pieces that are, rule is, you want to pull up, and I'm not really one for rules, but this is a good one. You want to pull up your loops about as high as your loop is wide, right? That's the general rule. With primitive rug hooking, I'm not going to pull it up that high, because then I'm using so much material. But I am pulling them up a little bit higher than I would with a thinner strip, right? Because they are substantial, and I'm not able to put them super duper close together, or the thing will start to buckle. So I am pulling them up a little bit higher. That was a little bit too far away. Right, so even somebody like me who's used to hooking quite a bit, sometimes I pull the last loop out or the last couple loops out, and I think to myself, not close together or too close together. And that is something that you get a feel for with experience as you go along. So all primitive hooking refers to really is the style of hooking. It's a style. It's wider strips. And because it's wider strips, we're looking at backings that are easier to use, looser backings, burlap, linen. Those are the ones I would recommend. We're looking at a pattern that doesn't have a ton of fine detail, right? Particularly if it's a smaller pattern. The larger the pattern, the more detail it might have. You can carry it off. But with most primitive patterns, if they're this kind of size or a little bit bigger, because the strips are so wide, you're not going to get fine detail. Right? So you want to think about patterns that are very simple, right? Not a ton of lines. Those are best for primitive rug hooking. While I'm hooking my primitive piece, might I decide that the eye is going to be too difficult, or the mane is going to be too difficult, or I want a little detail inside the ear? I might decide that. And you know what I might do? I might look at the strip that I meant to use for the inside of the ear. I might say to myself, well, surely this is the color for the inside of the ear. Am I going to use a piece similar to the pieces that I've been using? Am I going to use something that's this wide? That wouldn't make a lot of sense, right, for a fine piece. Say this is my strip, and I already ripped it, and I'm thinking, oh, it's just like the others. I want to hook with this, but it does seem a little bit wide. How am I going to get detail from this strip to do the center of the ear? Well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pick the strip up a second time, and I'm just going to cut it in half so that it's a much more narrow strip. Now, I'm still using my scissors in the same way. I have a much smaller strip in my hand, and I'm able to get in there to the center of the ear, right, if that's my intention. And now I am able to hook a little bit more detail. It still looks large, and I could have cut it thinner, right? But it's going to work better than this is going to work. So you make good decisions as you go along, right? The style is wide, it's primitive, it's old time, right? 19th century rugs, think of historic rugs. But you have to make good decisions as you go along, providing you have the right backing, you have a good big hook, you've got nice big pieces, and you're just going to hook things up same as you would in any other style, right? It's just a style, and enjoy. I will see you next time at Ribbon Candy Hooking.